American history is American history is driven by periodic moments of moral convulsion. The late the late Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington noticed that these convulsions seem to hit the United States every 60 years or so, starting with the revolutionary period of the 1760s and 1770s, and then the Andrew Jacksonian uprising of the 1820s and 30s, the progressive era which began in the 1890s, and the social protest movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. These moments share certain features. Nasty. Um, so these moments share certain features, and the people feel disgusted by the state of the society. Trust in institutions plummets, and, and more indignation is widespread. Contempt for established power is intense. A highly a moralistic generation appears on the scene. It uses new modes of communication to seize control of the national conversation. Groups formerly outside of power rise up and take over the system, and these are moments of agitation and excitement, frenzy and accusation, mobilization and passion. In 1981, Huntington predicted that the next moral convulsion would hit America around the second or third decade of the 21st century. That is, right about now, and of course he was correct. Our moment of moral convulsion began somewhere around the mid um, 2010s with the rise of a range of outsider groups, like the white nationalists who helped bring Fat Ass 45 to power, and the young socialists who upended the neo liberal consensus and brought us to Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. Activist students on campus, the Black Lives Matter movement, which rose to prominence after the killings of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice, and systems lost legitimacy. The earthquake had begun. The events of 2020 and the coronavirus pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, militias, social media mobs, and urban unrest were like hurricanes that hit in the middle of the earthquake, but they did not cause the moral convulsion, but they accelerated every trend of it. They flooded the ravines that had opened up in American society and exposed every flaw. Now, as we enter the final month of the election, and this period of convulsions careening towards its climax, Fat Ass 45 is in the process of shredding every norm of decent behavior and wrecking every institution he touches. Unable to behave responsibly and unable to protect himself from COVID-19, and he's unable to even tell the country the truth about his own medical condition. He undermines the basic credibility of the government and arouses the suspicion that every word and act that surrounds him is a lie and a fraud. Finally, he threatens to undermine the legitimacy of our democracy in November and incites a vicious national conflagration that would leave us a charred and shattered nation. Fat 45 is the final instrument of this crisis, but the conditions that brought him to power and make him so dangerous at this moment were decades in the making, and those conditions will not disappear even if he is defeated. This essay is in an account of the convulsion that brought us to this fateful moment. Its central focus is social trust, and social trust is a measure of the moral equality of a society, of whether the people and institutions in it are even trustworthy, and whether they keep their promises and work for the common good. When people in a church lose faith or trust in the imaginary God, the church collapses. When people in a society lose faith or trust in their institutions and each other, the whole nation as a whole collapses. This is an account of how, over the past few decades, America became a more untrustworthy society. It is an account of how, under the stresses of 2020, American institutions and the American social order crumbled and were revealed as more untrustworthy still. And we had a chance in crisis to pull together as a nation and build trust. We did not. That has left us a broken, alienated society caught in a distrust doom loop. When moral convulsions recede, the national consciousness is transformed. New norms and beliefs, new values for what is admired and disdained arise. Power within institution gets renegotiated. Shifts in the collective consciousness are no merry ride. They come amid fury and chaos when the social order turns liquid and nobody has any idea where things will end. Afterward, people sit blinking, battered and shocked on what kind of nation have we become. We can already glimpse pieces of the world after the current cataclysm. The most important changes are moral and cultural, and the baby boomers grew up in the 1950s and 60s, an era of family stability, widespread prosperity, and cultural cohesion. The mindset that they embraced in the late 1960s and they have been embodied ever since was all about rebelling against authority, unshackling from institutions, and celebrating freedom, individualism, and liberation. The emerging generations today enjoy none of that sense of security. They grew up in a world in which institutions had failed us, financial systems collapsed, and families were fragile. Children can now expect to have a lower quality of life than their parents, and the pandemic rages on. Climate change looms, and social media is vicious. Their worldview is predicted on threat, not safety. Thus, the values of the millennial and Gen Z generations that will dominate in the years ahead are the opposite of the boomer values, not liberation but security, not freedom but equality, not individualism but the safety of the collective, not sink or swim, not the secret sim meritocracy, but the promotion on the basis of social justice. Once a generation forms its general viewpoint during its young adulthood, it generally tends to carry that mentality with it to the grave the next 60 years later. A new culture is dawning. The age of precarity is here. One question has haunted me while researching this essay: Are we living through a pivot or a decline? During past moral convulsions, Americans rose to the challenge. They built new cultures and institutions, initiated new reforms, and a renewed nation went on to its next stage of greatness. I've spent my career rebutting the idea that America is in decline, but the events of these past 6 years, and especially of 2020, have made it clear that we live in a broken nation and the cancer of distrust has spread to every vital organ. Renewal is hard to imagine. Destruction is everywhere, and construction is difficult to see. The problem goes beyond this. The whole problem goes beyond Fat Ass 45. The stench of national decline is in the air. A political, social, and a moral order is dissolving. America will only remain whole if we can build a new order in its place. And this is the age of disappointment. The story begins, at least for me, in August of 1991. Actually, the person that's doing this article anyway, in Moscow, where the person was reporting for the Wall Street Journal. In a last desperate bid to preserve the regime, a group of hardliners attempted a coup against the president of the Soviet Union, who at that time was a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, or if not sure if I'm saying that name right. As as Soviet troops and tanks rolled into Moscow, Democratic activists gathered outside the Russian parliament building to oppose them. Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, mounted a tank and stood the coup down. In that square, I met a 94-year-old woman who was passing out sandwiches to support the Democratic protesters at that time. Her name, no, her name was Valentina Koseva. Not sure if I'm saying that name right either. She came to embody for me the 20th century and all the suffering and savagery we were leaving behind as we marched giddily in those days into the information age. She was born in 1898 in a town called Samara. In 1905, she said that the Cossacks launched programs in her town and shot her uncle and her cousin. She was nearly killed after the Russian Revolution of 1917, and she had innocently given shelter to some anti-communist soldiers for humanitarian reasons. But when the Reds came the next day, they decided to execute her. Only her mother's pleadings had saved her life. In 1937, the Soviet secret police raided her apartment based on false suspicions, arrested her husband, and told her family that they had 20 minutes to vacate the premises. Her husband was sent to Siberia, where he died from either disease or execution, but she never found out which. During World War II, she became a refugee, exchanging all her possessions for food. Her son was captured by Nazis and beaten to death at the age of 17. After the Germans retreated, the Soviets ripped her people, the Kalmyks, from their homes and sent them into what they call internal exile. For decades, she led a hidden life, trying to cover the fact that she was the widow of a supposed enemy of the people. But every trauma of Soviet history had happened to this woman. Amid the tumult of what we thought was the birth of a new democratic Russia, she basically said that her story without bitter. She recanted her story. She basically told her story without bitterness or rancor. If you get a letter completely free from self pity, it can only be from a victim of a Soviet terror. They are used to the worst kind of what the world can do, and nothing can depress them. Kosiba had lived to see the death of this hated regime and the birth of a new world. Those were the days of triumphant globalization. Communism was falling. Apartheid was ending. The Arab-Israeli dispute was calming down. Europe was unifying, and China was prospering. In the United States, a moderate Republican President George H.W. Bush gave way to the first baby boomer, what they call President, a moderate Democrat, Bill Clinton. The American economy grew nicely. The racial wealth gap narrowed, and all the great systems of society seemed to be working. Capitalism, democracy, pluralism, diversity, globalization. It seemed, as Fukuyama wrote in his famous "The End of History" essay for the national interest, an unabashed victory for economic and political liberalism. We think of the 1960s as the classic boomer decade, but the fall summer of the 1990s was the high water mark of that ethos. The, fir- the first great theme of that era was convergence. Walls were coming down. Everybody was coming together. The second theme was the triumph of classical liberalism. Liberalism was not just a philosophy; it was a spirit and a zeitgeist or whatever. A faith that the individual freedom would blossom in a loosely networked, democratic capitalist world. Enterprise and creativity would be unleashed. America was the great embodiment and champion of this liberation. The third theme was individualism. Society flourished when individuals were liberated from the shackles of society and the state, when they had the freedom to be true to themselves. For his 2001 book, Moral Freedom, the political scientist Alan Wolf interviewed a wide array of Americans. The moral culture he described was no longer based on mainline Protestantism as it had been for generations. Instead, Americans from urban bobos to suburban evangelicals were living in a state of what he called moral freedom. The belief that life is best when each individual finds his or her own morality, inevitable in a society that insists on individual freedom. When you look back on it from the vantage of 2020, moral freedom, like the other dominant values of the time, contained within it a core assumption. If everybody does their own thing, then everything will work out for everybody. If everybody pursues their own economic self-interest, then the economy will thrive for all. If everybody chooses their own family style, then children will prosper. If each individual chooses his or her own moral code, then people will still feel solidarity with one another and be decent to one another. This was an ideology of maximum freedom and minimum sacrifice. It all looks naive now, and we were naive about what the globalized economy would do to the working class, and we were naive to think that the internet would bring us together, and we were naive to think the global mixing of people would breed harmony, and we were naive to think the privileged wouldn't pull up the ladders of opportunity behind them. We didn't predict that oligarchs would steal the entire nations, or that demagogues from Turkey to the U.S. would ignite the ethnic hatred that we see today. We didn't see that a hyper competitive global meritocracy would effectively turn all of the childhood into elite travel sports where a few privileged performers get to play and everyone else gets left behind. Over the last 20 years, that this person sat with Kosovo, it all began to unravel. The global financial crisis had hit. The Middle East was being ripped apart by fanatics. On May 15th of 2011, street revolts broke out in Spain, led by the self-declared indignados, what they call outraged. They don't represent us. They railed as an insult to the Spanish establishment, and it would turn out to be the cry of a decade. We are living in the age of that disappointment. Millennials and members of Gen Z have grown up in the age of that disappointment, knowing nothing else. In the U.S. and elsewhere, this has produced a crisis of faith across what they call society, but among the young, it has produced a crisis of mistrust. The social trust is the confidence that other people will do what they ought to do most of the time. Um, if I'm sitting in a restaurant, I would trust you to serve untainted fish, and you trust me to not skip out on the bill. Social trust is a generalized faith in the people of your community. It consists of smaller faiths, and it begins with the assumption that that we are interdependent, and that our destinies are linked. It continues with the assumption that we share the same moral values and we share a sense of what is the right thing to do in a different situation. As Kevin Valier of the Bowling Green State University argues in his forthcoming book, which is Trust in a Polarized Age, social trust also depends on the sense that we share the same norms. If two lanes of traffic are merging into one, the drivers in each lane are supposed to take turns if you butt in line. Of course, if I'll honk indignantly. I'll be angry and I'll want to enforce the small fairness that rules make our society function smoothly. In high trust societies that have what Fukuyama calls spontaneous sociability, people are able to organize more quickly, initiate action, and sacrifice for the common good. When you look at research on social trust, you find all sorts of virtuous feedback loops. Basically, trust produces good outcomes, which then produce more trust. In a high trust society, corruption is lower and entrepreneurship is catalyzed. Higher trust nations have lower economic inequality because people feel connected to each other and they're willing to support a more generous welfare state. People in high trust societies are more civically engaged. Nations that score high in a social trust area, like the Netherlands, Sweden, China, and Australia, they have rapidly growing or developed economies. Nations with the low social trust like Brazil, Morocco, and Zimbabwe, they have struggling economies. As the ethicist Cecilia Buck once put it, whatever it matters to human beings, trust is the atmosphere in which it thrives. During most of the 2020 century, depression and wars, Americans expressed high faith in their institutions in 1964. For example, 77% of Americans said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most or all of the time. Then came the last two moral convulsions in the late 60s and 70s amid the Vietnam and Watergate scandal. Trust in the institutions had collapsed. By 1994, only 1 in 5 Americans said that they trusted the government to do the right thing. Then came the Iraq War and the financial crisis and the election of Fat Ass 45. Institutional trust levels remained pathetically low. What changed was the rise of a large group of people who were actively and poisonally alienated, who were not only distrustful but they were explosively distrustful. Explosive distrust is not just an absence of trust or a sense of detached alienation. It is an aggressive animosity and an urge to destroy. Explosive distrust is the belief that those who disagree with you are not just wrong but legitimate. In 1997, 64% of Americans had a great or good deal of trust in the political competence of their fellow citizens. Today, only a third of Americans feel that way. Falling distrust in institutions is bad enough. It's when people lose faith in each other that really begin to fall apart. In most societies, interpersonal trust is stable over the decades, but for some, like Denmark, where only 75% say that people around them are trustworthy, in the Netherlands, where 2/3 say the numbers have actually risen. In America, interpersonal trust is in a catastrophic decline. In 2014, according to the General Social Survey conducted by NORC at the University of Chicago, only 30% of Americans agreed that most people can be trusted, the lowest number of the survey has recorded since it started taking the questions back in 1972. Today, a majority of Americans say that they don't trust other people when they first meet them. Is mistrust based on distorted perception, or is it reflection of reality? Are people increasingly mistrustful because they are watching a lot of negative media and they get a falsely dark view of the world? Or are they mistrustful because the world is less trustworthy, because people lie, cheat, and betray each other more than they used to? There's evidence to suggest that marital infidelity, academic cheating, and animal cruelty are all on the rise in America, but it's hard to directly measure their overall moral condition of society and how honest people are, or how even faithful they are. The evidence suggests that trust is an imprint left by experience and not a distorted perception. Trust is the ratio between the number of people who betray you and the number of people who remain faithful to you. It's not clear that there is more betrayal in America than there used to be, but there are certainly fewer faithful supports around people than there used to be. Hundreds of books and studies on declining social capital and collapsing family structure demonstrate this. In the age of disappointment, people are less likely to be surrounded by faithful networks of people that they can trust. Thus, the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam argues that it's a great mistake to separate the attitude, which is trust, from the behavior, which is the morally right action. People become trusting when the world around them is trustworthy. When they are surrounded by people who live up to their commitments, and when they experience their country as a fair place. As Rallier puts it, trust levels are a reflection of the moral condition of a nation at any given time. I'd add that high national trust is a collective moral achievement. and high national distrust is a sign that people have earned the right to be suspicious, and trust isn't a virtue, it's a measure of other people's virtue. Unsurprisingly, the groups with the lowest social trust in America are among the most marginalized. Trust, like much else, is unequally distributed across American society, and the inequality is getting worse. Each of these marginalized groups has seen an additional and catastrophic decline in trust over the past few years. Black Americans have been one of the most ill-treated programs in American history, and their distrust is earned. And their distrust is earned distrust. In 2018, 37% of the white Americans felt that most people can be trusted, according to the General Social Survey, but only 15% of black Americans had felt that same. This is not general misanthropy, but black Americans have a high trust in other black Americans. It's the wider society that they don't trust, for good and obvious reasons. And black perceptions of America's fairness have tumbled together in the age of disappointment. In 2002, 43% of black Americans were very or somewhat satisfied with the way black people are being treated in the U.S. By 2018, only 18% felt that way, according to Gallup. The second disenfranchised low-trust group includes the lower middle class and the working poor. According to Tim Dixon, who's an economist at the co-author of a 2018 study that examined polarization in America, this group makes up about 40% of the country, and they are driven by the insecurity of their place in society and in the economy. Basically, he says that they are distrustful of technology and are much less likely to buy into conspiracy theories. They're often convinced by stories that someone is trying to trick them and that the world is against them. Distrust motivated many in this group to vote for Fat S-45 to stick a thumb in the eye of the elite who betrayed them. This brings us to the third marginalized group that scores extremely high in social distrust, the young adults. These are the people who grew up in an age of disappointment, and it's the only thing that they know. In 2012, 40% of baby boomers had believed that most people can be trusted, as did 31% of members of Generation X. In contrast, only 19% of millennials said that most people can be trusted. 73% of the adults under 30 believe that most of the time people just look out for themselves. According to a Pew survey from 2018, 71% of those young adults say that the most people would try to take advantage of you if they got a chance. Many young people look out at a world that they believe is screwed up and untrustworthy in what they call fundamental ways. A mere 10% of the Gen Zers they trust politicians to do the right thing. Millennials are twice as likely as their grandparents to say that families should be able to opt out of vaccines. Only 35% of the young people, like versus 67% of old people, believe that Americans respect the rights of people who are not like them. Fewer than a third of millennials say that America is the greatest country in the world, compared to 64% of the members of the silent generation. Human beings need a basic sense of security in order to thrive. As the political scientist Ronald Engelhart puts it, their values and behavior are shaped by the degree to which the rebel is secure. In the age of disappointment, our sense of safety went away. Some of this is physical insecurity, like school shootings, terrorist attacks, police brutality, and overprotective parenting at home, and that leaves young people incapable of handling what they call real-world stress. But the true insecurity is financial, social, and emotional. First, the financial security. By the time the baby boomers hit a median age of 35, their generation owned about 21% of the nation's wealth. As of last year, millennials who will hit an average age of 35 in 3 years owned had owned just 3% of the nation's wealth. Next, the emotional insecurity. Americans today experience more instability than any period in recent memory. Fewer children growing up in a married two-parent household, and more single-parent households, and more depression, and they have a higher rate of suicide. Then the identity insecurity. People today live in what the late sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called the liquid modernity. All the traits that were once assigned to you by your community you must now determine on your own, like your identity, your morality, your gender, your vocation, your purpose, and the place of your belongings. Self-creation becomes a major anxiety-inducing act of young adulthood. Finally, social insecurity. In the age of social media, our sociometers, like the antenna we use to measure how other people are seeing us, are up and on a high alert all the time. Am I liked? Am I affirmed? Why do I feel invisible to some people? We see ourselves in how we think others see us. The snarkiness turns into any self-doubt. their criticism into my shame, their obliviousness into my humiliation. Danger is ever present. For many people, it is impossible to think without simultaneously thinking about what other people would think about what you're thinking. The educator Frederick de Boer has written, "This is exhausting and deeply unsatisfying. As long as your self-conception is tied up in your perception of other people's conceptions of you, you will never be free to occupy a personality with competence. You're always at the mercy of the next person's dim opinion of you and your whole your whole deal. In this world, nothing seems safe. Everything feels like chaos. Distrust sows distrust. It produces the spiritual state that Emil Durkheim called anami. I don't know if I'm saying that right. A feeling of being disconnected from society, a feeling that the whole game is legitimate, that you were invisible and not valued, a feeling that the only person you can really trust is yourself. Distrustful people try to make themselves invulnerable, and they armor themselves up into a sour attempt in a sour attempt to feel safe. Distrust and spiritual isolation led people to flee intimacy and try to replace it with stimulation. Distrust, anxiety, are at the root of the 73% increase in depression among Americans who are aged 18 to 25, going from the year 2007 to 2018. And of the shocking rise in suicide when we have no one to trust, our brains can self-destruct. Ulrich Bolser writes in his book on the science of trust, called The Leap. People who are plagued by distrust can start to see threats that aren't there, and they become risk averse. Americans take fewer risks and are much less entrepreneurial than they used to be. In 2014, the rate of business startups hit a nearly 40-year low. Since the early 1970s, the rate at which people move across state lines each year has dropped by 56%. And people lose faith in experts, they lose faith in truth. In the flow of information that is the basis of modern society, a world of truth is a world of trust, and vice versa. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes in his book Morality, "In a period of distrust, you get surges of populism. Populism is the ideology of those who feel betrayed. Contempt for insiders rises as contempt for insiders rise, as does suspicion toward anybody who holds authority. People who are drawn to leaders who use the language of menace and threat, and they tell the group burst group power narratives. You also get a lot more political extremism. People seek closed, rigid ideological systems that give them a sense of security. As Hannah Arendt once observed, fanaticism is a response to existential anxiety. Sorry, but when people feel alone, they revert to tribe. The radius of trust shrinks, and they only trust their own kind. Fat Ass 45 is the great emblem of an age of distrust, a man unable to love, unable to trust, and when many Americans see Fat Ass 45's distrust, they see a man who looks at the world as they do. By February of 2020, America was a land mirrored in distrust, then the plague arrived. From the start, the pandemic has hit the American mind with sledgehammer force. Anxiety and depressions have spiked. In April, Gallup recorded a record drop in self-reported well-being, as the share of Americans who said they were thriving fell to the same low point as during the Great Recession. These kinds of drops tend to produce social upheavals. A similar drop was seen in a Tunisian well-being just before the street protest that led to the Arab Spring. The emotional crisis seems to have hit what they call a low trust group the hardest. And Pew found that low trusters were more nervous during the early months of the pandemic and more likely to have trouble sleeping, and they're more likely to feel depressed and less likely to say the public authorities were responding well to the pandemic. 81% of Americans under 30 reported feeling anxious, depressed, lonely, or hopeless at least one day in the previous week, compared to 48% of adults who are now 60 and older. Americans looked to their governing institutions to keep them safe, and nearly every one of their institutions betrayed them. The fat ass downplayed the crisis, and his administration was a daily disaster area. It still is. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention produced what they call faulty tests, and they failed to provide up-to-date data on infections and deaths, and didn't provide a trustworthy voice for a scared public. The Food and Drug Administration wouldn't allow private labs to produce their own tests without a lengthy approval process. The sense of betrayal was magnified when people looked abroad. and nations that ranked high in the World Values Survey measure of what they call interpersonal trust, which is like China, Australia, and most of the Nordic states, leaders were able to mobilize quickly and come up with a plan, and they counted on citizens to comply with the new rules. In the low trust states like Mexico, Spain, and Brazil, there was less planning, less compliance, less collective action, and more death. Countries that fell somewhere in the middle, which included the US, Germany, and Japan, they had a mixed record depending on the quality of their leadership. South Korea, where more than 65% of the people say they trust government when it comes to healthcare, was able to build a successful test and trace the regime thing. In America, only 31% of the Republicans and 44% of Democrats say the government should be able to use cell phone data to track what they call compliance with experts. The coronavirus social contact guidelines, such as a system, was never fully implemented. For decades, researchers have been warning about institutional decay. Institutions get caught up in one of those negative feedback loops that are so common in a world of mistrust. They become ineffective and lose legitimacy, and people who lose faith in them tend to not fund them. Talented people don't go to work for them. They become more ineffective still. In 1969, Daniel Patrick Moynihan made this core point in a memo to his boss to be, which was then President-elect Richard Nixon. In one form or another, all of the major domestic problems facing you derive from the erosion of the authority of the institutions of American society. And this is a mysterious process of which the most that can be said is that when it starts, it tends to not stop. On the right, this anti-institutionalism bias has manifested itself as hatred of government, in an unwillingness to defer to expertise, authority, and basic science, and a reluctance to fund the civic infrastructure of society, such as a decent public health system. And a state after state, Republican governors sat what they call inert and unwilling to organize or to exercise authority, believing that individuals should be free to take care of themselves. On the left, distrust or institutional authority has manifested as a series of checks on power that have given the small actors the power to stop common plans, producing what Fukuyama calls a vetocracy. A vetocracy. Power to the people has meant no power to do anything, and the result of it is a national nimbalism that blocks social innovation in case after case. In 2020, American institutions groaned and sputtered, and academics wrote up a plan after plan and lobbied them into the internet. Few of them went anywhere. America has had lost the ability to build a new civic structure to respond to ongoing crises like climate change, opioid addiction, and pandemics, or to reform existing ones. In the high-trust areas, according to Yuval Levin, who was an American Enterprise Institute scholar, and the author of A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, and how recommitting to our institutions can revive the American dream, people have more of a first-person plural instinct to ask, what can we do? In a lower trust era like today, Levin told me there is a greater instinct to say, they're failing us, and we see ourselves as outsiders to the systems, an outsider mentality that's hard to get out of. Americans haven't just lost faith in institutions, they've come to basically, they come to loathe them. Even to think that they are evil. A Democracy Fund Plus UCLA Nationscape survey found that 55% of Americans believe that the coronavirus causes COVID-19 was created in a lab, and 59% believe that the U.S. government is concealing the true number of deaths. Half of all faux news viewers believe that Bill Gates is plotting a mass vaccination campaign so he can track people. This spring, nearly a third of Americans were convinced that it was probably or definitely true that the vaccine existed but was being withheld by the government. When Fat 45 was hospitalized for COVID-19 on October 2nd, many people conspiratorially concluded that the administration was lying about his positive diagnosis for political gain. When government officials briefed the nation about how sick he really was, many people assumed that they were obfuscating, in fact, that they were. The failure of and withdrawal from institutions decimated America's pandemic response, but the damage goes way beyond this. That's because institutions like the law, the government, the police, and even the family don't merely serve the social functions. Levin said they form the individuals who work and live with them. The institutions provide rules to live by, standards of excellence to live up to, and social roles to fulfill. Yeah, and it goes on and on and on. I don't have time to read all of it because it's going to be like a 40-minute video if I continue reading. So yeah. But you get the idea. But if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rambin' Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.